Welcome in Brian Fonseca. He's the director of Florida International University's Institute for Public Policy. Also with us, Daniel Di Martino, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and Venezuelan opposition activist. Gentlemen, great to have you both here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Brian, I think by some people's calculations, we are already in our conflict with Venezuela. We see these drug boats being taken out. President Trump has also hinted at the prospect of the CIA doing covert operations on Venezuelan soil. What do you see as the next step in our attempts to get Nicolas Maduro to, either flee someplace or to, cede power to somebody else?
The strikes off the coast are certainly about drug trafficking, but as you point out, this is also about amassing enormous U.S. military pressure on Venezuela in the hopes that that pressure will actually lead to some type of fracture. A fracture among the political elite, a fracture among the military, some form of fracture that ultimately leads to displacing Maduro and a transition back to democracy. And so what you might see next is to up that pressure is strikes within the Venezuelan territory. A lot of experts have sort of suggested that's what's coming next, that striking boats off the coast is limited in terms of the return on investment. But when it starts to look at targets inside Venezuela, that could be more consequential for U.S. pressure. That could create the fractures I think that the United States is looking for. And ultimately, that's what would lead to some type of displacement of the regime.
Daniel, there have been so many Venezuelans who have come to this country looking for freedom, a freedom that they once enjoyed in their home country. Talk to us about the dissident movement and their hopes for the future of Venezuela.
Well, yes. Remember, Venezuela is a country that used to welcome immigrants, millions of them, including my own family in the 1950s, and from all over the world. And now it's a country that instead of exporting oil, exports people, exports crime, exports drugs, and influences elections in other countries. That's how communists in Latin America have gained power, through financing from Maduro as well. Gustavo Petro in Colombia, who's giving trouble to the United States, for example. Lula da Silva in Brazil. The Kirchners, before Milei put them out of power in Argentina. So many people that the Maduro regime collaborates with that terrorize the United States, now even Hezbollah, Iran. And so if Venezuela were to become a free country again, not only would the U.S. stop receiving criminals, stop receiving immigrants that cost money, but the U.S. will also gain a valuable ally, more oil production that will lower energy prices. It would be a win-win for all.
Brian, some of our audience might remember Operation Just Cause in Panama in 1989 when the United States military went in and arrested Manuel Noriega. Nicolas Maduro has been indicted. Those indictments were unsealed back in 2020. Is there any potential for a similar type of mission based on, the indictments that have been filed against Nicolas Maduro?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's going to be very difficult for the United States to actually make that decision to intervene in the way that they did in Panama in 1989. In fact, I've often said this is more like Panama in 1903 when the U.S. parked ships off the coast of Panama when it was rebelling against Colombia, and that ultimately led to a free Panama and the building of the Panama Canal under American ownership. I think it's more akin to that, in which the United States, again, is amassing massive pressure, not just in the form of rhetoric. That was 2000. Sort of first Trump administration, 2019, there was a lot of rhetoric about all options being on the table. I think Trump 2.0 is showing that those options are on the table and sort of flexing by using military force in a way that it didn't do in the first Trump administration, but all as a means of pressure. Intervening would be very difficult for the United States because ultimately then the United States may have a pronounced role on the ground. In this administration, this president has said no new wars, and so I think he's going to work to avoid an actual kinetic conventional conflict on the ground and instead continue to mass pressure, which ultimately leads to some type of fracture within Venezuela and ultimately a transition away from the regime towards democracy.
And Daniel, what we've seen in the region is not necessarily new, even though some of the players are new, as the United States in previous administrations has not focused enough attention, quite frankly, on Central and South America and the Caribbean. We see the Chinese moving in there, gaining a foothold and expanding that influence. And that really is the alternative to having the United States and a robust presence in the region, as China will just use the territory, the natural resources to expand their empire.
That is absolutely true. And also China, Russia, and Iran use Venezuela as a base to infiltrate into the U.S. Remember, Masih Alinejad, for example, the Iranian dissident that was almost assassinated in New York City, they were going to kidnap her or kill her. And if they kidnapped her, it would have been to Venezuela. They're using Venezuela as a base. So I think we also need to understand that pressure is not going to be enough. Maduro is not going to leave because he has an aircraft carrier on the coast. If there are no actual threats and land strikes that threaten to either kill or kidnap or harm people in the top leadership of the Maduro regime, they really have no reason to leave, which is why I think the administration is either going to bluff or they are going to be forced to do land strikes. And I think that's the correct path.
Yeah, there are reports, Brian, real quickly, that there have been over 50 dissidents arrested in Venezuela. Give us your take on Nicolas Maduro's level of comfort right now and how he feels. Does he feel secure?
No, I mean, he's incredibly uncomfortable. There's no doubt about it. And I agree with Daniel. I think that the United States does have to have a path towards exit here. I don't think a U.S. invasion is in the cards, most likely. I do think there are fissures, though. And I think a fracture of the political elite or a fracture of the military is a legitimate path toward transition that doesn't necessarily compel the U.S. military to be on the ground in a conventional conflict. I think that would be far more consequential for the United States in terms of enduring presence on the ground and have to clean up, after a conventional conflict. So I think the fracture is what they're looking for. But again, they're flexing heavy by having all of these assets and creating a degree of uncertainty that keeps that pressure on the regime and ultimately in the hopes that the regime will crack. There's no doubt that Maduro is uncomfortable under this. His focus right now is 100% on survival. And certainly there are thoughts about whether or not there's a pathway to exile. Otherwise, again, it could be a really grim outlook for the regime going forward.
All right, Brian Fonseca from FIU and Daniel Di Martino from the Manhattan Institute. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Great to get your insights.
Thank you.